In October 2008, the body of 29-year-old Emily Carter was discovered in the stockroom of the Hearthstone, a family-owned pizzeria in Ashland, Oregon. An investigation soon uncovered the shocking affair between Emily and her married employer, 45-year-old Richard Allen. In 2007, at the Hearthstone located in downtown Ashland, a series of events began that would ultimately unravel a secret relationship, escalating into betrayal, violence, and tragedy. On the early morning of October 12, 2008, the soft hum of an approaching delivery truck broke the silence surrounding the Hearthstone, a quaint pizzeria nestled in the heart of Ashland, Oregon. It was 6:30 a.m., and the delivery driver, a familiar face to the restaurant staff, parked in his usual spot near the back entrance. What greeted him that morning was not the warmth of a bustling kitchen, or the cheerful morning routine he had come to expect, but a heavy, unnatural stillness. As the driver approached the restaurant stockroom to drop off the weekly shipment of ingredients, he noticed the door slightly ajar. That was strange. Emily Carter, the restaurant's manager, was known for her diligence and attention to detail. She would never leave the door unsecured, especially overnight. Hesitant but curious, the driver pushed the door open and stepped inside. What he found turned his morning routine into a living nightmare. Emily's lifeless body was sprawled on the cold stockroom floor, her neck marked by the twisted fabric of a kitchen apron that had been used to strangle her. A dark gash on her temple suggested a blunt force injury, and a pool of blood had begun to seep into the cracks of the tile. The driver stumbled back in shock, his mind reeling. The small-town community of Ashland prided itself on its safety and sense of camaraderie, and such a brutal scene felt unimaginable. Fighting panic, he reached for his phone to call the police, his trembling hands barely able to dial the numbers. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting an eerie glow against the restaurant's brick walls. Detectives and officers swarmed the scene, but almost immediately there were whispers among them. The murder looked like a robbery gone wrong. But not quite. Nothing added up. The cash register at the front of the restaurant was untouched, its drawers still neatly closed. The restaurant's safe, tucked away in the manager's office, had not been tampered with. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting that whoever had entered had access to a key or knew how to get in unnoticed. The unsettling details didn't stop there. Investigators noted how deliberate the staging appeared. A few items had been knocked off shelves, as if to create the illusion of a struggle. But it was all too precise, too neat. It was clear that this crime had been planned, and whoever had done it wanted to shift the focus away from a personal motive. As the investigation began, the focus inevitably turned to the people closest to Emily Carter. She wasn't just any manager. Emily had been the heart of the Hearthstone for 6 years. At 29 years old, she was widely respected for her work ethic, organization, and ability to connect with everyone she worked with. Yet, Emily's life was not as picture-perfect as it seemed. Emily had grown up in Ashland, the middle child of a modest family, and had carved out her own path with grit and determination. While she appeared to be a woman in control, her close friends knew otherwise. Behind her bright smile and professionalism, Emily was carrying secrets that would shock even those who thought they knew her best. She had been confiding in Megan, her closest friend, for months, sharing cryptic hints about a complicated situation at work. Megan had tried to press for details, but Emily had always deflected, saying only that it was something she had to figure out on her own. The truth was, Emily had become entangled in an affair with Richard Allen, the restaurant's owner. Richard, at 45, was a pillar of the community, known for his charm and generosity. He was the type of man who could command a room, hosting charity events, and sponsoring the local soccer league. He had built the Hearthstone from the ground up with his wife, Laura, and was admired for his business savvy. But behind closed doors, Richard's life was crumbling. The restaurant, while outwardly successful, was under financial strain. Bills were piling up, and profits had dipped in recent months, though he kept these struggles hidden from everyone, including his wife. It was during these late nights, poring over ledgers and receipts, that Richard and Emily's relationship had crossed a professional boundary. What began as harmless late-night conversations about work had deepened into something neither of them had anticipated. Richard found solace in Emily's youthful energy and understanding nature, while Emily was drawn to Richard's charisma and the authority he wielded. Their relationship was intoxicating, a dangerous mix of passion and secrecy, and it quickly spiraled out of control. Richard's wife, Laura, had started noticing the cracks in their marriage long before Emily's death. At 42, Laura had spent the last 20 years building a life with Richard, raising their 2 teenage sons while he focused on the restaurant. She had always admired his drive, but lately, his late nights and growing distance were impossible to ignore. Laura had asked him more than once if everything was okay, her voice tinged with concern, but Richard always reassured her with the same excuses. "The restaurant's just demanding more of me these days," or, "It's just the finances, nothing to worry about." Deep down, Laura sensed something was wrong. She noticed the way Richard's demeanor changed when Emily was around. He was always attentive, always finding reasons to involve Emily in discussions that didn't require her input. Laura told herself she was overthinking things, that Richard was simply invested in mentoring his staff. But the doubts lingered. Meanwhile, Emily had grown increasingly restless. The affair, which had once felt thrilling, now felt suffocating. She had confided in Megan about her frustration, describing how Richard seemed unwilling to make any real changes in his life. "He's not going to leave her," Megan had warned. Emily had brushed it off, but Megan's words echoed in her mind. In the weeks leading up to her murder, Emily had begun pulling away, refusing to meet Richard after hours and avoiding their usual late-night phone calls. Richard had noticed the shift, and it unnerved him. As detectives pieced together Emily's final days, these tensions began to surface. They spoke to co-workers who described an unspoken but palpable chemistry between Emily and Richard. Staff members mentioned noticing how Richard's eyes lingered on Emily during staff meetings, how he always found excuses to talk to her, even when it wasn't necessary. Some even recalled moments of tension between the two, quiet arguments behind closed doors that left Emily looking flustered. The threads of Emily's life, once so tightly woven, were unraveling. And as investigators delved deeper, it became clear that her death was not a random act of violence, but the result of a tangled web of secrets, lies, and betrayal. In the quiet hours of the night on October 11, 2008, the hearthstone sat dark and empty, its cozy dining area devoid of its usual hum of conversation and clinking plates. Outside, a light drizzle tapped against the windows as Richard Allen sat alone in his car in the nearly deserted parking lot. The glow of the dashboard illuminated his tense face as he rehearsed what he planned to say. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and his heart raced with a mix of dread and resolve. Inside the restaurant, the stage was set for a confrontation that had been building for months. By this point, Richard's relationship with Emily Carter had reached a breaking point. What had started in 2007 as long, casual conversations after work, discussions about improving business, personal goals, and dreams, had gradually grown into something far more dangerous. At first, Emily had been hesitant to cross the line. She respected Richard's position as her employer, and was well aware of his marriage to Laura. But Richard had a way with words. He could make anyone feel important, valued, and special. Emily, caught in a vulnerable moment of her life, was no exception. Richard painted an appealing picture of a future with her. He spoke of leaving Laura, of starting over, of running the restaurant together as equals. For a while, Emily believed him. She told herself that he was serious, that the late-night drives and secret meetings were just the beginning of something more meaningful. But as the months stretched into years, her patience began to wear thin. By the summer of 2008, the cracks in their relationship were impossible to ignore. Emily had started to grow restless. She was tired of being Richard's secret, tired of the lies and the guilt. She had begun to see the promises for what they were: empty. Richard had no intention of leaving his wife. He loved his public image too much. His family, his reputation, and the hearthstone were all intertwined. To leave Laura would mean risking everything he had worked for, and he wasn't willing to take that chance. Their arguments became more frequent. Emily, once quiet and accommodating, began to push back. She wanted more from him: public acknowledgement, commitment, and action. Richard, on the other hand, wanted things to stay the same. He wanted Emily to stay silent, to remain in the shadows, so his life could remain intact. But Emily was done waiting. By September 2008, she had made up her mind. She confided in her best friend Megan, revealing the full extent of the affair and her growing frustration with Richard. Megan, alarmed, urged her to reconsider any drastic actions. But Emily was determined. She told Megan that she was planning to confront Laura if Richard didn't make a decision soon. "I'm not gonna be his dirty little secret anymore," she had said, her voice filled with conviction. That conviction brought her to the hearthstone late on the night of October 11th, 2008. Richard had called her earlier in the day, asking her to meet him after closing to talk things through. He assured her it would just be the two of them, and that they could finally figure out a way forward. Emily agreed, though deep down, she was wary. She arrived at the restaurant at 9:15 p.m., her car pulling into the nearly empty lot. Security cameras captured her walking inside, her expression tense but resolute. Inside, Richard was waiting. The stockroom, usually bustling with staff during the day, now felt cold and oppressive under the harsh fluorescent lights. Richard tried to stay calm, but his nervous energy was palpable. He began by trying to placate Emily, telling her that he needed more time, that they could find a way to make things work. But Emily had heard it all before. She didn't want more time. She wanted action. She laid out her ultimatum. He needed to tell Laura the truth, or she would do it for him. The conversation grew heated. Richard, feeling cornered, began to panic. He begged her to reconsider, but Emily refused. She accused him of stringing her along, of making promises he never intended to keep. Her voice was steady, but her frustration and anger were clear. Richard, on the other hand, was unraveling. The thought of losing everything, his marriage, his business, his reputation, was unbearable. He couldn't let it happen. In his desperation, Richard's mind raced for a solution, but the only thought that surfaced was to stop Emily. His emotions boiled over, and in a moment of blind rage, he acted. He grabbed a kitchen apron from a nearby counter and lunged at her. Emily's eyes widened in shock as he wrapped the fabric around her neck, pulling it tight. She struggled, clawing at his hands, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. The room filled with the sound of her muffled gasps and the scrape of her shoes against the tile as she fought to break free. Finally she stopped struggling. Her body went limp, collapsing to the floor. Richard stood over her, his chest heaving as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. But panic soon replaced shock. His mind screamed at him to act, to cover his tracks, to make it look like something else, anything else. He looked around the room, his eyes darting to the shelves and counters. Grabbing a nearby wine bottle, he struck Emily's head, ensuring she wouldn't wake up. Blood pooled around her, staining the floor in a dark, spreading circle. He then knocked over a few items, hoping to stage the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. But no matter what he did, the sight of Emily's lifeless body haunted him. The night was silent again as Richard slipped out of the restaurant. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with humidity, clinging to his skin as he climbed into his car. The clock on the dashboard read 11:45 p.m. as he drove away, leaving behind the lifeless body of a woman whose only crime had been believing in his promises. The hearthstone, once a place of warmth and community, now held a dark secret that would soon unravel, exposing the tangled web of lies and betrayal that led to Emily Carter's tragic end. In the days following October 12, 2008, the murder of Emily Carter sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Ashland, Oregon. The hearthstone, once a symbol of community and comfort, was now the epicenter of a tragedy that no one could make sense of. The police initially approached the case as a possible robbery gone wrong. The scene in the stockroom, a few scattered items, Emily's lifeless body, and the faint scent of cleaning chemicals, seemed to suggest it. But as the investigation deepened, cracks in that theory began to appear. Detective Sarah Bennett, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for meticulous work, was among the first to sense something wasn't right. She had been on countless robbery cases, and this one felt staged. The untouched cash register, the lack of forced entry, and the oddly deliberate scattering of items all raised questions. While the initial assumption was that a stranger had broken in, Detective Bennett couldn't ignore the possibility that this crime was far more personal. The level of violence, Emily's strangulation and the blunt force trauma to her head, suggested a level of rage that didn't align with a random robbery. As the investigation moved forward, the police began interviewing those closest to Emily. Richard Allen, as the owner of the restaurant and Emily's employer, was one of the first people contacted. He seemed cooperative at first, expressing shock and grief over Emily's death. He described her as a valuable employee, and someone he admired for her dedication to the hearthstone. But there was something about his demeanor that unsettled Detective Bennett. His answers were rehearsed, his emotions controlled in a way that felt unnatural. And then there was his body language. He avoided eye contact, his hands fidgeted, and his voice occasionally cracked under the weight of certain questions. Despite his initial cooperation, Richard's alibi was vague. He claimed to have been at home on the night of the murder, catching up on paperwork for the restaurant. Yet, when pressed for details, what time he went to bed, whether anyone could confirm his whereabouts, his responses faltered. He mentioned no witnesses who could corroborate his story, which struck the detectives as odd. Most people, even when spending a quiet night at home, could account for something. A phone call, a receipt from a late-night trip to the store. Richard offered nothing. The turning point came when forensic evidence began to speak louder than words. A thorough examination of the crime scene revealed fibers on Emily's clothing that matched the fabric of a jacket later found in Richard's car. His fingerprints were also discovered on a bottle of cleaning solution left near Emily's body, a detail that was difficult to explain given his claim of not being at the restaurant that night. Forensic analysis placed Richard at the scene with a precision that could not be ignored. As the evidence against him mounted, a new layer of the story emerged. Emily's best friend Megan came forward with information that would seal Richard's fate. In the weeks leading up to her death, Emily had confided in Megan about her affair with Richard. Megan, visibly shaken as she recounted their conversations to the detectives, revealed how Emily had been growing increasingly fearful of Richard's temper. Emily had told her about the arguments, about how Richard seemed to unravel whenever she pushed him to make a decision about their future. She had even shown Megan texts from Richard, messages that alternated between desperate pleas to keep their relationship secret and veiled threats about what would happen if she didn't. Megan handed over the texts, which painted a picture of a man spiraling under the weight of his own deception. One message in particular stood out to the detectives. Sent just days before Emily's murder, it hinted at Richard's growing desperation and fear of losing everything. It was enough to warrant a deeper look into his life, and what they found confirmed their suspicions. Richard was under significant financial pressure, with mounting debts tied to the hearthstone. The idea of a public scandal, losing his marriage, his business, and his reputation, was something he could not afford, emotionally or financially. On November 3, 2008, police arrived at Richard's home with a warrant for his arrest. The scene was a stark contrast to the controlled demeanor he had displayed during earlier interviews. As officers escorted him out of the house, neighbors peeked from behind curtains, whispering in disbelief. Richard, once a respected figure in the community, now stood accused of a horrific crime. At the police station, Richard initially maintained his innocence, repeating the same rehearsed statements he had given before. But as the interrogation stretched into the early hours of the morning, his composure began to crack. Detective Bennett pressed him with the evidence, his fingerprints, the fibers, the texts from Emily, and slowly the weight of it all began to break him down. His shoulders slumped, his voice wavered, and finally, he confessed. Richard described the murder as a moment of weakness, an act committed in the heat of the moment. He claimed he had never intended to kill Emily, that the confrontation that night had spiraled out of control. He painted himself as a man under unbearable stress, overwhelmed by financial troubles, and the fear of losing his carefully constructed life. It was an accident, he insisted, though the detectives listening to his account were skeptical. The deliberate staging of the crime scene and the brutality of the attack suggested otherwise. As his confession ended, Richard slumped back in his chair, his face pale and drawn. He seemed less like the confident business owner the town had once admired, and more like a man haunted by the weight of his actions. For the detectives, the confession marked the beginning of the end of their investigation. For Emily's family and friends, it was a step toward justice, though it could never undo the pain of losing her. The small town of Ashland braced itself for the fallout as the news spread. Richard Allen, a man who had once been a pillar of the community, was now at the center of a scandal that would leave a permanent scar on the town's history. His arrest marked the unraveling of a carefully maintained facade, revealing the dark and desperate choices that had led to Emily Carter's tragic death. In March 2009, the trial of Richard Allen began, captivating the nation with its shocking revelations and tragic undertones. The courtroom buzzed with a palpable tension, packed with reporters, legal enthusiasts, and locals who had once regarded Richard as a pillar of their community. Cameras flashed outside, capturing every arrival, while inside, whispers of disbelief rippled through the spectators. At the defendant's table, Richard sat slumped, a shadow of the once confident man Ashlyn had admired. His pallid complexion and hollow expression betrayed the weight of the accusations against him, the enormity of what he had done. The prosecution wasted no time in delivering a meticulously constructed case, weaving together a narrative that left little room for doubt. They began with the physical evidence, the matching fibers found on Emily's body, Richard's unmistakable fingerprints, and the trail of incriminating text messages Emily had sent to her best friend Megan in the hours leading up to her death. These messages painted a harrowing picture of Emily's fear and Richard's growing desperation. The prosecution described him as a selfish, narcissistic man who prioritized his reputation above all else. He had manipulated those around him to maintain his image, and when Emily threatened to expose his secrets, he made the calculated decision to silence her permanently. They detailed how Richard had staged the crime scene to look like a robbery gone wrong, a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators and shield himself from blame.